Good afternoon. Welcome to our Budget Committee meeting for September 9th. I'm joined by my colleagues, Council members Andrew Johnson, Philippe Cunningham, Jeremy Schrader, Steve Fletcher, Andrea Jenkins, and Kevin Reich. We are a quorum of the Budget Committee and are tasked with its business. Our only business today is to start off our conversation post-Mayor's budget address with a presentation from our Budget Director, Micah Intermill. You might remember, my colleagues, that last year Micah did two separate presentations on the budget, and we've consolidated it into one this time around. I think you're going to like it. The intention here is to give more detail and context around how the mayor's budget was formed. So things like how our levy came to the percentage point that it is and the different levers and things that affect it. And I think it will give a good framework for starting our department by department budget presentations that follow. I believe our first set of them is on September 12th, so this week. So I think I'll just get right to it and invite Director Intermill up. Thank you for being here and thank you for putting together this presentation. I'm excited to hear it.
Madam Chair and Council members, thank you for having me. Micah Intermill, the city's budget director, and I think were I to characterize the point of this presentation a little bit differently as the father of an 18-month-old, this is the vegetable eating portion of our budget calendar, and when the departments come later, you'll get to eat your macaroni and cheese. And to Council Vice President's question, I'm not sure if there's dessert. That probably comes with markup at the end. We'll start out just as I always do, acknowledging that while I stand here every year and let you know what's gone into the mayor's recommendation, there are a whole host of people standing behind me. So first and foremost, Mark Ruff and Lori Johnson, our CFO and Deputy CFO, continue their expert leadership of the city's Finance and Property Services Department. Our budget office in particular this year took on a little bit more than they're used to as we launched a new budget system, had some turnover in our staff. As you know, Gina Powell is no longer with us in the budget office. She's joined the city clerk's office, and Jane DeSenza has joined us in Gina's place and picked up right along with the team, and we're very excited about her and her work. Lyle Hodges, the city's controller, and the accounting staff do a lot of the work that goes into compiling the numbers that you see in the book, as well as department heads and program staff who put a lot of work each year into the city's budget. So, starting off with a financial overview, just looking at what's changed in total in the city's budget. In total, the mayor's recommended budget, excluding the independent boards, and as we go through the presentation, I'll highlight where the independent boards are included and excluded from the graphs because it does bounce back and forth a little bit. But excluding the independent boards, the city's budget will grow under the mayor's recommendation by $70 million. Now, when you look at the two budgets side by side in the bar graphs here, the 2019 budget as adopted is on the left, and that shows the bulk of the budget. In the lighter blue is the ongoing spending. The gray bar that you see shows one-time spending, and then the dark blue is our capital budget. Moving to the right, there's an additional bar that is in sort of that lightest blue color, and that is just shows for the first time this year, so 2 years ago, we moved to self-insuring for medical. And so that was a change that had happened in budget cycle, and so it wasn't picked up in the budget book. Last year, as we were continuing to implement, we also didn't include it. But this year, for the first time, we're showing that revenue and expense, and so that's that $70 million difference. Absent that bar, most of almost entirely, the ongoing change that's added this year in the mayor's budget just takes the place of one-time capital and operating spending from last year. And I should say, at any point in time, don't hesitate to jump in and ask questions if I can help clarify. So looking at the general fund specifically, the general fund, and I see an error there on my slide, it should say 2020 general fund expense budget grows by about $26 million or 7.4%. A third of that is shown on the right-hand side of this pie chart. About $10.1 million is just current service level growth discounted for additional revenues that offset it. That alone would increase the general fund budget by 2.9%. The next section that you see in the bottom of the pie chart in the light gray is our some items that I'll talk about in depth a little bit later. Mayor's recommending some changes to financial policy is how I'm sort of categorizing those items that do add to the levy or to the general fund spending this year of $5.9 million or about 1.7% in total. The Parks and Streets deal that was forged in 2016 and started in the 2017 budget adds about $400,000 to the general fund this year. There's another chunk of funding in the debt levy, but in the general fund, $400,000. That would be about 0.1%. Excuse me. And the mayor's change items that he's recommending total about $8.8 million in the general fund. Those alone would increase the general fund budget by about 2.5%. And finally, you remember last year was the first year of a policy change enacted by the legislature to increase the employer contribution for para for police and fire. So that added $900,000 last year, adds another $900,000 in 2020, or about 0.3% to the general fund budget. So in total, that's how we get to the increased general fund budget of $26.2 million, or about 7%. Moving on to the other funds, and I'll move through these a little bit quicker. The Special Revenue Fund is seeing a 10% decrease. That's directly related to the fact that there's less affordable housing or TIF spending on affordable housing in the 2020 budget. The capital projects funds are seeing lower spending by about 14%, and that's related to the 2019 was the big year for construction on the new office building. 2020, that's lesser. For debt service funds, there's a slight decrease there, and that just has to do with the sort of somewhat cyclical nature of our debt structure. Our internal services, that's where you see the big increase in that fourth grouping, and that's related to the medical self-insurance that I spoke about. And finally, the enterprise funds, we see a little bit higher spending. That's related to just inflationary increases in our utility funds. Those increases total about 4.04%. And would result in an increase on an average household of just over $4 or about $4 a month or $50 a year.
Mr. Intramural, question or comment from Councilmember Cunningham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Intramural. I was just wanting to get some clarification around the increase due to the self-insurance with the medical benefits. What I have read thus far in the budget is that those expenditures have actually been significantly less than what we're projected. So why do we see such an increase as a result of that?
Councilmember Cunningham, thank you for the question. It's a good one, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. So When the city moved to medical self-insurance, we did so with the hope that we would be spending less on medical insurance costs, because that's the experience that we've seen of other large employers. That has borne to be true. And so we are spending less on medical insurance as an employer than we otherwise would have had we not gone to that self-insurance model. The difference here is just it's an accounting. So we hadn't been showing that revenue and expense in last year's budget. This year we're showing that, and so it shows up as a change, but in reality it's no change.
Great, thank you for that clarification.
So moving to the revenue side of the equation, and this year I wanted to give you a little bit more context around how we add up to the 6.95% levy increase that the mayor has recommended. So to start off, there's cost growth across not only the general fund levy, but also the levy for the park board, levy for MBC, the Municipal Building Commission of $13.09 million. That para-police and fire increase that I had mentioned of about $900,000. And then the park board increase beyond what was included in the 5-year financial direction. So when departments were coming to speak with the mayor about the budget, the park board also came and spoke with him and identified that their current service level cost growth had outpaced the 4% levy increase that was included in the 5-year financial direction by this $1.23 million. And so the mayor included that current service level growth in the budget. In total, this current services costs of $15.2 million would increase the levy by 4.35%. Beyond that, there were a few other planned increases that were included in the 5-year financial direction. So the first relates to the city's contingency, general fund contingency that we carry. And the contingency is the kitchen table equivalent is the city's emergency savings fund. So if you need a repair to your home or your car, financial planners would suggest to keep a certain amount of money saved in an emergency fund. City financial policy requires that we keep 1% of general fund expenditures in that rainy day fund. In prior years, that fund had been replenished annually using one-time funding. And so, again, going back to our kitchen table equivalent, that's sort of like banking on getting a bonus at the end of the year in order to pay for next year's emergency fund. So not necessarily the best thing we could be doing from a financial planning standpoint. Much to her credit, Mayor Hodges recognized this and started a plan, I believe in the 2017 budget, that over 5 years would build that contingency to full funding through the levy. This year, the plan added $1 million. And then, as I mentioned, the 20-year Parks and Streets deal continues to, we continue to add spending through the levy of about $2.4 million. In total, those other planned increases of about $3.3 million would increase the levy by another 0.96% to a total of 5.31%. The next set of numbers relate to changes that occurred in the state legislative session.
Wait, Director Intramural, if
Yes.
I might pause you there. A question or comment from Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to get a clarification with regards to the park board funding. The prior page, if you can go, the 1.23 million beyond the 2.35 that we give every year. I mean, what was it last year? Did we give them any extra money last year or the years before? If you could speak to that.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Warsame, yes, last year the mayor included, off the top of my head, which is always dangerous, about $800,000 in his recommended budget. And then the Park Board asked the Board of Estimate and Taxation to increase that by another $100,000, which they did. So last year it would have been about, I believe, $900,000 beyond current service level. This year, $1.23 million beyond current service
So this
level.
is significantly more than
Yes.
prior years? Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Cunningham?
And just to clarify with a backup, follow-up question from that, so, but that is to maintain current service levels. That's not to add new programming. So just to clarify, it's because the projection was underneath what the actual current service level growths were.
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember Cunningham, I believe last year it included some additional programming.
Okay.
In addition to current service level. This year, it's current service level only.
Great. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
You bet.
Director Indermill, were there any other things not being called out as an MPRB specific increase, but are part of the mayor's budget going forward that are for Park Board expenditures? And could you help us highlight and understand what those are?
Madam Chair, certainly. So on this, the other planned increases slide here, the 20-year Parks and Streets deal certainly benefits the Park Board as well as the city in terms of the helping to take care of some of that ongoing deferred maintenance. So that would be supportive of the Park Board. Our pension levies that take care of our closed pension obligations to the state also help support the Park Board.
I also understood that there were some additional FTEs that were hired at the end of last year that hadn't been accounted for, and that we assume that into the base budgeting for this year for the Park Board. Is that the case?
So, Madam Chair, and I would encourage you to ask this question of the Park Board when they come later in October as well, but when my memory is that when they presented to the mayor, they did raise that issue that I believe there are 4 positions that were added through their budget markup process that were supported with one-time funding in 2019, that this current service level then is also helping to cover ongoing.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Great. So back to the state legislative impact. So there were 4 major legislative changes in this year's session. The first is the increase to local government aid, which is being felt all across the state. Here in Minneapolis in particular, that increase comes to about $2 million. However, there was at the same time, so the second big change is the sunsetting of a provision, para aids that were shared again by many jurisdictions across the state. The city of Minneapolis saw $500,000 decrease in state aids because that para aid sunsetted. So in taking those 2 changes together, there was an increase of $1.5 million coming from the state to help, local government aid is seen as, many times seen as buying down the levy impact. So those 2 together help buy down the levy impact by $1.5 million. The pension levy savings here is a result of 2 separate items related to the city's closed pensions. So the first is related to the general MRF general fund. So when the city pensions merged into the state and MRF merged into para, the city and state forged an agreement of how to get to fully funding those pensions over the long term. The state over the past 2 biennia was reducing the amount that they were planning to contribute in the out years, which would have increased the city's required contribution in the future. So because of that, we had been gradually increasing our levy for closed pensions so that we could eventually pay for those additional costs if they were to come to fruition. At the same time, our legislative team in intergovernmental relations continued to work to make sure that the state kept that bargain and restored that funding in those out years, the tails years, as they're referred to at the state. And they did this year. So with Governor Walz's budget, he proposed fully funding that agreement in the out years. The legislature maintained that through their markup of the governor's recommendation. And so the city now has certainty, relative certainty, that the state will continue that original bargain that was met, which results in, which had they not kept their bargain, the city would have seen an additional $6 million payment out of the general fund each year for the closed pensions. And so $6 million was saved in future pension levies because that deal was kept. The fourth and final impact that I'll mention is related to the closed Minneapolis Police Relief Association, Minneapolis Fire Relief Association. So when the city's police and fire pension merged into the state system, there was a separate agreement on how we would get to fully funding that. There was some uncertainty in the language that was put into law this year. Ways and Means Chair Warsame, the mayor, our CFO Mark Ruff did a lot of work with para and legislators to clarify that language and lock in a payment moving forward. The result of that action reduced our future, or next year's liability and future by about $3.5 million. So those two together are $9.5 million. All told, those state legislative changes reduce the need for a property tax levy by about $11 million. And so they're buying back that previous increase that I'd shown by just over 3%. So adding all of these things together, the maintaining current services, supporting the planned increases, and with state support, we would now be at a 2.17% levy increase. But the mayor also made some changes related to some financial policy choices. So the first is recognizing there are signs that the economy is starting to slow down a little bit. And when the economy slows, one of the first things to drop off in terms of city revenues will be construction permits. And I've not gone through a recession at the city myself, but I understand from those who have that happens. That's the leading indicator. So there's no warning that it's going to come. But given the signs that we're seeing more broadly in the economy, what the mayor has done here is pull back on the assumption for what we will be receiving in permit revenues, construction permit revenues next year by about $3.5 million, which itself adds 1% to the levy. I think the important piece to recognize when we're talking about construction permits is that because of the construction that occurs in the city, these in many times very complex, very large scale construction projects, the activity of inspecting the construction often lags the payment of the permit by 1 to up to 3 years. And so we'll be having work to do after the revenue starts to slow. And so that's what this increased property tax levy intends to do, is to help pay for that activity once the less money start coming in. The second item that is listed here is reducing the planned BET levy. So the Board of Estimate and Taxation has undergone a change in staffing for the first time in almost 40 years, which is nothing to sneeze at. In that change, staff took a look at the fund balance that exists in the Board of Estimate and Taxation's fund that they operate out of. And because there is sufficient fund balance to pay for next year, the mayor is recommending no levy for the BET in 2020, but then restoring a levy in future years. The third and fourth bullets here, affordable housing and neighborhood/NCR, I'm sure are piquing a few eyebrows. I will talk about those in depth in later slides, but what I can say here is that in the five-year financial direction and during markup last year, you may recall that Councilmember Gordon added an increase of $3.5 million to begin to plan for paying for neighborhoods in NCR through the property tax levy once the consolidated TIF expires at the end of 2020. So these two items add to that $3.5 million, and we'll give you some more detail on the spending of that $3.5 million in a few slides. On that contingency item that I had mentioned earlier, so Mayor Hodges started a plan in the 2017 budget, and it was to go through the 2021 budget. What Mayor Fry is recommending here is to go ahead and accelerate that and fully fund that contingency this year, so that adds $1.6 million. And then just utilize some additional one-time transfers of fund balance from other funds into the general fund of $430,000. So those things all told combine to $8 million of additional expense. So if we add all the things that we've been talking about, so the current services, maintenance of current services, supporting the planned increases that were in the five-year financial direction, discounting for the state support and adding these financial policy choices, we would be at an increase of 4.44%. So finally, the mayor's change items in the general fund net of additional revenues. And this year, departments were challenged to, if they were going to ask for additional funding through a change item, also bring some thoughts on how either existing budget could be repurposed or new monies could be brought to the table. A good example of this is actually in the Finance and Property Services Department. Our department head suggested we bring some investment management in-house, which would reduce our investment management fees by about $200,000. The expense of that FTE is $120,000. So on net, that change item benefits the general fund by about $80,000. So these figures here are net of any revenues. We see $4.8 million of ongoing change items, $4 million of one-time change items. So that total of about $8.8 million adds 2.51% to the levy. So all of those things combine to our 6.95% increase.
Ta-da. Councilmember Fletcher and then Cunningham.
Thank you, Chair. So I appreciate the sort of observation that the net, that these change items are net of revenue and that there were potentially trade-offs and benefits associated with these. When we get to the department reports, will we be able to get sort of a reporting on the gross so that we get a sense of what the actual impact is of the changes that are proposed? Because I think I want to make sure that departments that took the mayor's direction seriously and are looking for opportunities to find efficiencies are getting credit for that. And also we want to make sure we see where it's not happening or where we are just really seeing a proposal to increase spending. So.
Madam Chair and Mr. Vice Chair, I think off the top of my head, I don't know that we have prepared departments to give that level of detail in their presentations, but I would be happy to compile that information and share it with the council broadly.
I think that's a very fair question as people come to give their departmental presentations. Also, if there's time in the departmental presentations, I've asked all department heads to be prepared to talk about what they received last year and what they were doing with it. So there are $30 million worth of changes from last year, and how is that going? If they got an FTE in last year's budget, have they filled it? If not, what are the barriers to them using last year's allocation accordingly? Councilmember Cunningham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I actually have two questions. The first is just to clarify, so with the accelerating the contingency funding, that's adding the 1.6 on top of the $1 million, so we'd be adding 2.6. What is the amount that we're trying to get to and by when?
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember, that's correct. Through the 2020 recommended budget, the mayor is suggesting we would add $2.6 million to the levy to pay for the contingency. In total, the amount that we're getting to is, it varies from year to year because the contingency requirement is a percentage of the total general fund spend. For 2020, it's 5.1 million. And so in successive years, a little bit will need to be added each year, but not 5 million. Instead, it would be 50 to 100,000.
Okay. And then the second question I have is around tax capacity and the revenue that's coming in. So I know we talked about how so we're losing money from tax increment financing, and then can you talk about a little bit more about the fiscal increment value captured and the fiscal disparities contribution and why we're losing so much money through those two tax groups?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Cunningham, absolutely. If you'll indulge me, we do have a section later on specifically related to those items. I think that what I would say generally is the market value continues to increase. This year, the increase in market value was about equal. It was about 7%, so almost equal to the increase in the levy, which is different than we've seen over the past few years. The past few years, the market value has outpaced the growth in the levy. But we'll talk about that item more a little bit later.
Great, thank you.
So just looking at our non-property tax levy, just some other revenue highlights. Again, our discussion of medical self-insurance is what's driving the change in our charges for services. Our use of fund balance is down from the 2019 budget, and that's just reflective of less one-time spending. Our long-term liabilities proceeds, again, is down. We're taking on less debt to pay for the new office building in 2020 than we did in 2019. And then the last bullet point that I have here is related to franchise fee revenues. So in our budget, in our general fund, we receive about $35 million of revenue related to the city's franchise fees on gas and electric as well as cable. In both areas, we're seeing some instability related to decisions that are being made at the federal level. So the first item is related specifically to the gas and electric franchise fees. After the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is commonly known as the Trump tax cuts, when that was passed, the corporate earnings or corporate tax rate went down, and so Excel and CenterPoint saw their revenues go up because they were paying less out in taxes. And so at the time, CenterPoint was in front of the Public Utilities Commission with a rate change, and so that was factored into the rate change, and so we didn't see an impact here at the city. Excel had already gone with a rate change, and so the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, said, well, wait a minute, if your earnings went up, you can refund that back to your customers because they should enjoy your tax cut. And so what that did was push down the money that that change led to Excel restating its earnings, and when it restated its earnings, or restated its revenues, I should say, reduced what they brought in, and since franchise fees are a tax on revenues, that meant that they notified us that they would be reducing their payment of franchise fees by $800,000 for 2018 and again for 2019. We're still trying to understand how that will continue to evolve over time. The second item here, the cable franchise fees, there's been a decision through the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to reevaluate what is considered a payment of franchise fees and how that's calculated. And so now cable companies can include in-kind contributions such as the services that they provide to government buildings as that payment. And so that has the potential to reduce our cable franchise fees as well. We're still working with outside counsel to understand exactly how much that'll be, but I did want to raise it because there is some instability there in a line item that is not insignificant in our general fund revenue picture.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Can you tell us roughly how much the cable portion of the franchise fee is? I feel like there's significant instability there beyond even that ruling in how we define what a cable company is as everybody moves to broadband and other kinds of ways of distributing information. So if we're relying too heavily on that revenue source, that seems like something that we want to probably be more active in that conversation and also give ourselves a little bit of cushion for if that conversation goes badly.
Councilmember, Madam Chair and Councilmember, it's a good question, and as a cord cutter myself, it is something that I've thought about what that sort of impact is, because franchise fees. So rather than using traditional cable provider in Comcast, I receive internet service through USI Fiber. And so I don't pay franchise fees, even though on that service, even though I live in the city of Minneapolis and I'm able to stream that same programming. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but I can get it to you. So in general, this expenditures by category is a slide that I like to share with you just to, again, underscore the relative stability that exists in our budget. Though we talk about it every year, and though we have good, important debates on changes from year to year, our 1.5 last year, $1.6 billion this year budget is, the mix stays about the same, and it's the two big pillars of our spending are what you would expect a city to spend its money on: staffing, that you see in the top right of the budget, so 22% on salaries and wages, 9% on fringe benefits, and infrastructure, which you see in the 31% at top left.
I regret that the template for the city of Minneapolis doesn't exactly give a lot of opportunities to look at different types of shading for these. It's a little bit hard to see.
Point taken, Madam Chair, and we can work on that for future presentations. So additionally, this is a slide that I shared with you last year. Though the city is made up of 24 different departments, the three largest chunks of funding, so public works, public safety, which I'm defining here as police and fire, and our capital expenditures, those three big chunks alone make up 2/3 or 66% of our city's spending. Beyond that, the coordinator departments, which are all looped together here, so not only the city coordinator itself, but the internal services that report up to it, as well as CPED and the convention center, those combine to add another 24% of our spending, and the remaining 10 departments then are spending 10% of the budget. So there is some, not all departments are created equal in terms of their spending.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you define what is included with capital improvement?
So, Madam Chair and Council Members, so capital improvements would include all of our construction on roads, sewers, bridges, the new public buildings that we build, all of that large infrastructure.
And one of the reasons why we are seeing, I think it's a 12% change, is because of the fact that we aren't having the public service center included as well. But it's not necessarily, we're not seeing a cut, and we might get to it, but we're not seeing a cut to like public infrastructure in terms of roads and streets and that sort of infrastructure.
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember Cunningham, so that decrease that we're seeing is just less spending, and we're still spending on the new building in 2020, just at a lower rate than in 2019. So yes, no cut to our planned spending on roads, bridges, and that other infrastructure.
Great, thank you.
So I'll briefly talk through the major changes in the mayor's budget in terms of change items, and I think that it's better for you to hear from departments themselves what the mayor has recommended for them. But by and large, there are three big pillars to the budget here, the change items. The first, before I get there, just some context. So what the mayor's added in change items in total is $8 million ongoing, $21 million one time. That compares to over $22 million ongoing requested and over $34 million one time. So certainly there were more asks than there was capacity to give a yes. Beyond that, three major pillars, the first being affordable housing, much like last year. We see $31 million in local resources going to affordable housing, falling across the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, naturally occurring affordable housing, the Stable Homes, Stable Schools program, which is budgeted for year 2 of 3 in 2020, and a host of other strategies to help tackle that problem. This funding compares to $40 million of local resources in 2019. The second pillar is economic inclusion, making sure that the growth that we're seeing in the economy is felt by all, and doing that in an intentional way. So the item that's perhaps received the most discussion this year is funding for cultural districts, which I know many of you at this dais are intimately involved with the creation of. Those districts, just for posterity's sake, are along West Broadway Avenue, Central Avenue, Cedar Avenue, Franklin Avenue, East Lake Street, and 38th Street. And so there are a number of different strategies here, ranging from a commercial property development fund to help folks get businesses started, to enhance lighting and litter pickup along those in these districts, expansion of the Great Streets facade grant program, additional investment in arts in these cultural districts, and $100,000 for a new co-op and employee owner opportunity fund for folks who want to either create new businesses under a cooperative business model or convert existing businesses to that co-op or employee-owned model. These items will be discussed in the Public Works presentation and the CPED, Community Planning and Economic Development presentation, and the City Coordinator's Office, I believe. The other economic inclusion items include additional investment in the MSP Tech Hire job training program for folks who are entering the tech sector, the Great Streets Real Estate Gap Financing Program, and additional staffing for the city's small business team out of CPED.
As we go forward, I do want to point out to my colleagues that we just restarted speaker management, so that is another way to put yourself in queue, but I'll be looking for people's flags as well. I don't think that's going to be super important today, but it might as we go into further departmental presentations. So I just wanted to let you know there's both of those ways.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the third pillar is relating to public safety and police community relations. The mayor's included $150,000 for the group violence intervention Southside expansion. The GVI group violence intervention program in total is budgeted at $740,000. $300,000 for continued mental health co-responder program. It's worth noting here that the county is contributing additional funds in 2020 beyond what they had contributed in 2019. It's not exactly a 50-50 share, but it's getting closer. The $143,000 for to expand the community navigator program, so to add a navigator to support persons experiencing homelessness and opioid use disorder. A little over $400,000 to implement recommendations from the opioid task force, and then the addition of 14 sworn officers to MPD, 8 as neighborhood outreach officers or beat cops, 3 as investigators in domestic violence and sexual assault, and 3 in a newly reformed traffic unit. Finally, just some other highlights related to conversations that I've had with either one or many of you over the last few weeks. There is a $4 million one-time change item for the 2020 elections generally. So as a reminder, we will have 3 elections in 2020, a presidential nominating primary, the regular primary, and then the general election. The city clerk is working closely with the state to secure additional funding for that. I recently heard the Secretary of State on NPR saying that the state was he's recommending to the state legislature that they make additional money available for that, recognizing the additional election will trigger additional costs for municipalities. $260,000 related to energy and climate change programming, and just under $550,000 for the phased sunset of the Regulatory Services Revolving Fund. This will be year 1 of 2 of a plan to move staff from a fund whose revenues are starting or have been declining for a few years onto the general fund so that we can continue the activity, which is mostly related to rental property inspections. Also some work related to nuisance abatement related to long grass and other items. So I had mentioned earlier that I would be talking in more depth about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Finance Plan, and this is that time. So with this plan, what the mayor has said is that he intends to set a new floor for the annual investments in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I've met with many of you along with Peter Ebnett of the mayor's staff, and the way that Peter has described it is that the goal here is to provide clarity and reasonable assurance that to the development community that funds will be available. It's hard when you don't know how much will be there to know what to plan for in your mix of sources for your development. And so in laying out this plan, the mayor's intent is to provide that additional clarity and by extension increase that production occurring through the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. What you'll see is a mix of the property tax levy as well as use of tax increment financing and the federal Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, and home programs. And just for context, the prior baseline that had been understood, what folks would expect from the trust fund was a baseline annual amount of funding of $2 million from TIF sources and $4 million from those federal sources. So this is the plan in graphic form. So each of these bars represents an annual funding amount from 2020 to 2027. And working from the bottom up, the light blue is excess tax increments financing that comes from outside of the consolidated TIF district. And outside of the consolidated TIF district is important for the conversation and will be important for the neighborhoods and NCR financing plan that you'll see next.
Director Intramural, want to recognize Councilmember Cunningham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we don't actually have a trust fund, like an affordable housing trust fund in the traditional sense of how it's structured. Can you explain why we don't actually have that particular structure, and how that could impact a different finance plan?
So, Madam Chair and Council Member, I think the city in prior years has talked about an affordable housing trust fund, and what that fund that was referred to was a mix of individual funds. Some of it would come from general fund one-time sources. Some of it would come from this excess monies in TIF funds. We have tried to pare that back into a smaller mix of funds, but for various accounting reasons, we keep these monies in the funds where the dollars originated at the city. If we were to have an individual trust fund, it would just mean all of the monies were pooled in one fund and that interest would return to that fund. I'm going to look to the CFO to see if the interest that's earned on the TIF funds goes back to those funds. So it does stay with those funds. So largely and if you'd like to add to this, Mark, you're welcome.
Well, if I may just add real quick before Mr. Ruff dives in, I know that, for example, in Chicago, and this is partly a policy question as well, but if developers do not include a certain amount of affordability within the development, their housing development, that they are charged then a fee that goes into it. And so I'm just curious as to whether or not like that has been discussed from a finance office perspective.
Sure, Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham. I think to add to Micah's comments, we have made some changes to the financial policies and practices that make this funding mechanism more like a trust fund. So, for example, previously it took staff and council authorization to roll that money over from year to year. And now it's that money, when I say that money, it's all the sources that Micah mentioned, the TIF, the federal funding, the general fund, stays within that fund and was there available in case one project falls out. They can immediately repurpose that money, they being CPED staff, into another project. And so there are some elements that we're trying to get closer to a trust fund. I think ultimately, you as council have the authority to decide how to leave money in one fund or not, and so the trust is really the public trust as opposed to a formal document that says we will never ever use this money for anything else. To answer your question about developer payments, certainly the council is a part of inclusionary's zoning and all of the discussions going on around different options. If one of the options that emerges from that is a potential for payments, then clearly, yes, you could put that money into this particular fund. So I think what we've developed is now developers and staff all know this money for rental housing as the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, so it's taking on a life of its own to some extent. So that's the comment I would make as well.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Schrader.
Just to follow up on that, like Councilmember Cunningham talked about how this is not a traditional trust fund. One of the biggest barriers being that we didn't have a dedicated source of funding. And my concern is that at the state level, there's been incentives for cities to set up a trust fund. And under the ones we've seen, Minneapolis wouldn't qualify. Would these changes allow us to take advantage of to qualify more?
So I'm not familiar with those changes that you mentioned, and I haven't heard those conversations.
Basically, with the additional levy increase, would this be considered a dedicated fund in the traditional sense of the word?
So thank you, Madam Chair and Council Member. So with this plan, this doesn't dedicate funds, but it identifies them and designates them, and sort of designates that plan. Once the dollars are appropriated, then they're dedicated. But if this plan is adopted, then years 21 through 27 are still just a plan, and there's no direct tie between the dollars coming in and the dollars that would then be going out.
Good, thank you.
Each bar represents 1 year, 2020 through 2027. The light blue that you see at the bottom is that previous baseline, so that previously established minimum TIF level. The darkest blue that you see is the federal funds that we talked about. The top two sections, so the medium color blue and the light gray, those would be the sort of new commitment or new planned commitment. The medium color blue being additional TIF monies that could be pooled that are coming from outside of that consolidated district again. And then the gray bar at the top is $1.5 million of property tax levy that would be identified annually, recurring, unless a future council chose to change that, to be spent for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So in total, this plan represents sort of a planned commitment of $82 million over 8 years. 50 million of that funding, so everything excluding the dark blue bars, is from local sources, and 35 million represents new planned commitment. So then the next plan is neighborhoods and NCR. So the important point, again, that I've heard Peter stress in several meetings is that this plan represents a financial framework and not a set of policy decisions related to neighborhoods or future funding of neighborhoods or NCR. Council, you all will make those choices later this year. What this is about and what this is intended to do is to create the room for you to make those policy choices up to continuing current levels of funding without having to worry about that later on after you make the policy decision. The goal here is to help answer the question, what happens when that consolidated TIF district expires at the end of 2020? And this was a question that we started to discuss last year in the budget markup process. And again, I'll recognize Councilmember Gordon for adding room into that 5-year financial direction to potentially pay for the current level of funding through an increased property tax levy that would have been increased over 2 years. You'll see here that this plan would be over 5. Neighborhoods under this plan would be funded for 3 years with the excess TIF coming from the consolidated district. So when the district expires, there will be an amount of excess TIF that's been collected that would be used for for 21 through 24 for funding neighborhoods, and then would move to the property tax levy beginning in 2024. And NCR operations would be funded in 2021 and beyond through the property tax levy. So this is a little bit of a messy graph, and I'll try and walk you through it. The lines represent sources of funding, so dollars coming in. The bars represent uses or dollars going out. So there's no bar in 2020 because the approximate $7 million that's budgeted for neighborhoods in NCR is still on the consolidated TIF district. So that's just why it's not showing up in this plan that talks about what do we do in the future after the consolidated TIF goes away. The gray line is showing the excess consolidated TIF. So I had mentioned $11 million in excess that will be available once the district expires at the end of next year. The blue line represents new property tax levy beginning in 2020. That money that's levied in 2020 will be saved to be used in future years. And then that increase, as I had mentioned, is phased in over 5 years, up to $7 million, as opposed to phasing it in over 2. So not creating as much of an impact on the property tax levy in those first 2 years. The gray bars represent the spending on neighborhoods in those first 3 years. So it's the money. The gray bar corresponds to the gray line. So the excess consolidated TIF is being spent in over 3 years on neighborhood funding. The blue solid bar beginning in 2024 then is the property tax levy supported spending on neighborhoods. The last piece of this puzzle is the diagonal blue line shaded bar at the bottom, and that corresponds to the blue line representing property taxes. So that is property tax supported spending on NCR operations at current levels inflated for current service level growth over time.
Councilmember Gordon.
It looks like the bars are getting a little bit higher, so if we put a cost of living increase assumption here, I think we have, but could you just tell us what it is?
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember, that's correct. There's that current service level or cost of living adjustment only on the NCR operations bar of about 3%.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have two questions. The first is there a projected levy increase between 2023 and 2024, and what would that look like?
Madam Chair and Councilmember, there is a projected increase between 2023 and 2024, and that's included in one of my last slides.
I'm so excited.
You're 2 steps ahead of me.
All right. Well, my second question, I'll pause on that one. But the second question I have is within the coordinator's office, we see almost a 54% increase. Where is that living?
So, Madam Chair and Councilmember, that is the self-insurance, the medical self-insurance that we had talked about earlier. That shows up as an expense under the Human Resources Department.
Great. Thank you so much.
So, if there are no more questions on that, then we get to what all of this means for property tax impacts. And so I won't go through each line here for you, but just highlight that, again, overall the increase that the mayor is recommending is 6.95%. When we look at how much is for the city versus how much is for other entities, about 78% supports Minneapolis directly, and so that's a combination of the general fund levy, bond redemption levy, pensions, and MBC. But I think, again, city, as Councilmember Palmisano called out, Chair Palmisano called out earlier, some of those levies also benefit the Park Board and MBC as well. So just a few highlights from that slide. The general fund levy, if you remember the beginning of the presentation, general fund spending is only up by about 7%, but the levy is up by 13%. What's the difference? Well, it's 2 things. It's the financial policy choices that the mayor is recommending here, as well as relatively flat non-general fund revenues. And so as our costs are growing by about 4%, those non-general fund revenues are growing by about 1% to 2%. And so again, this year, as you saw, that local government aid increase is important to the city of Minneapolis, but that increase is sort of the exception, not the rule, when it comes to our non-property tax levies. The second bullet point here, the closed pension fund levies reduced dramatically, and that relates to the conversation earlier about the legislative changes and the reasonable certainty that they have provided, fixing the payments for the closed police and fire contributions, and then returning the restoration of that original deal on the MRF General Fund contributions. The last point to highlight here is that because of that additional $1.23 million beyond what the five-year financial direction projected, that Park Board levy increase is about 50% greater in the mayor's recommendation than it was in the five-year financial direction. So these are just all sort of part of the mix when we look at those individual levies line by line. Overall, we're seeing all major property classifications growing, with the largest growth being seen in apartments, next largest in residential. It's always hard when we provide this historical look to decide how far back to go. This year, I thought 15 years will be a good benchmark. So we have seen that property tax levy grow over the past 15 years, pretty steady over time, leveling out a little bit in the early part of the decade when the city was feeling the effects of the Great Recession. Over the same time horizon, we see the median value trend doesn't grow in that same straight line. And so home values dipped in 2011, 12, 13, well, I guess starting back as early as 2008 through 2013, bottoming out at that point, and have returned since then. What's important here, and I should say again, it says 10% increase in 2019. That's true. What it should also say is it's a 7% increase in 2020. So, let me hold that thought. So our overall market value increasing 7%, but new construction is only adding about 2%. And I think that's a common question that I know you all get, that I get when I'm out in the public talking with residents. They see a lot of construction and they assume that because there's a lot of construction, their property tax should be going down. But really what's driving the change in market value is inflation on the existing property stock. And so that's the counterbalance there. There are other factors to Councilmember Cunningham's question earlier that influence what the property tax levy change feels like for an individual property owner. One of those is the market value exclusion program for homesteads. As the city's median residential value is growing, it's getting closer to the point where that market value exclusion phases out. So if your property is less than $413,000, your taxable market value is less than your estimated market value. And that's intended to give people a little bit of break on their property taxes on that property that they both own and live in. As we're aging out of that program, so to speak, we are seeing bigger increase impacts on individual property taxpayers. The next bullet here, the fiscal disparities program, the city of Minneapolis shares its tax base with other metro jurisdictions. We are a net contributor to that program. Not too many years ago, we were a net recipient of that program, meaning we used to get more back in fiscal disparities distribution than we gave into the pool as a contribution. In 2020, we will be giving back about $30 million more than we're receiving. And so that $30 million is a big number to think about in the absolute. When you're thinking about an overall tax base of about, $500,000, $600,000, it's less, but it's not insignificant. Also, tax increment financing impacts the feels like, for those parcels that are located in a TIF district, what their impact will feel much different because they're in that district than those who are outside of one. Off the top of my head, the tax increment value that's then excluded from the general pool is about 80 to 90 million.
Councilmember Jenkins and then Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Mr. Intermill. I'm just curious, do we know where the fiscal disparities dollars are going, as it were, in the metro? I'm sure it's in the metropolitan area, but...
Madam Chair and Council Vice President, we do know, we have that information from the county. I don't remember it off the top of my head. I can share it with you. We are, $30 million we're on the high end of the contributors. I think we're the second largest contributor. There isn't a $30 million recipient, I don't believe. I do know that St. Paul does receive quite a bit.
And then I guess, I'm looking at a couple of slides back, change in value, the 2020 taxes payable, and the commercial property tax is less than half the sort of renter's property tax, as it were. And we had a presentation last week that showed the significant rise in our greenhouse gases are coming from our commercial properties. And I think you may have mentioned it earlier, but you did not mention it on this slide. But I'm just curious, is the federal taxes the driver in this sort of disparity between commercial and apartment property tax?
So, Madam Chair and Council Vice President, this slide is showing the percentages are the percentage increase in each category. It's not the absolute value of each category. So there is more commercial property value than apartment property value. It's just that given all of the construction of apartments, there's this large spike in apartment values.
And then I guess my last question is related to the self-insurance for medical. You indicated that it is, we're potentially saving money. Are we providing the same level of service for health insurance for our employees?
So, Madam Chair and Council Vice President, I would encourage you to ask that question of the HR department, as they're the ones who do the most direct work with the plan. I think that it's fair to say that largely the plan is unchanged. And to qualify a little bit the savings comment, it's we are seeing perhaps more costs avoided as opposed to hard savings. So there is an increase in our total spending on medical self-insurance, but it's just not as high as it would have been had we not been self-insuring. So it's a slight distinction, but I think an important one when you are looking at the budget over time.
Thank you very much.
So
Wait, if I could, Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair Palmisano. Just one quick question on the market value exclusion program, because I'm a little surprised to see that in here as a significant influence. And so I just want to clarify, in case my understanding is incorrect, if your home is valued at $410,000 one year, so you're under that $413,000 cap, and then it goes up $5,000 to $415,000, you're still eligible for the homeowner or the homestead rate on your first $413,000, correct? Or do you get excluded from it?
Madam Chair and Council Member, that's correct. I think that what you'll see in a future slide is that it used to be that the percentage tax change on a non-homesteaded property was several percentage points higher than a percentage tax change on a homesteaded property. Now, because the median homestead value is approaching the 413 mark, the tax impacts are largely similar. But it's a very good point and one well taken. So the last point I wanted to make here is that, again, a common question that I receive when I'm talking with the public and one that you receive as well is, if my market value is going up, why do you have to increase the levy? And I think that rooted in that question is a belief that the property tax, the way we tax properties is similar to the way that we tax incomes. And unfortunately, that's not correct. Unfortunately, just by way of comparisons, it's not correct. The way the property tax works, if you make more money, you're going to pay more tax because that rate is fixed. Now it changes depending on how high your tax or how high your income is, but the rate is fixed from year to year unless there's a law change. The way property taxes work is that a different rate, the way property taxes work in Minnesota, is that a different rate is calculated every year based on two things. One, what's the levy? And two, what's the total market value? And so because those two factors can change independent of each other, the rate does vary from year to year. Again, very much unlike income taxes. Over the past few years, the increases we're seeing in the levy in 2018, 2019 were around 5.5%. The increases that we were seeing in the median value were 10%. And so the median value increase has far outpaced the increase in the levy. Just for comparison, over the last 5 years, the levy has increased 30%, whereas market values have increased 58%. And so when you put those two things together, the city's property tax rate has actually dropped 13% since 2015. And so if we were in a system where the rate was fixed and as property values grew, we just levied more tax, we would be levying $50 million more in 2020 than the mayor has recommended in his budget. And so I think that's just an important piece of context, and I can send you all some talking points as well for questions you may get from the public. But I think it's one of the most common misconceptions that I hear is that if my value's gone up, my taxes should be going, or you shouldn't have to levy more money, and it's just the two are separate, and it's very complex. So, specific to the mayor's recommendation for 2020, again, the recommended levy increase is 6.95%, and each individual parcel will feel different, but if you live in the home that you own and it grew by the median of 6%, your property tax increase would feel like a 7.9% increase. And that right there is the effect of reaching the phase out for the market value exclusion program. So that increase would be about $111 in 2020. The change for apartments is higher. The change for commercial properties is around the same, but this is what we would expect to see for those sort of the fictitious median valued home, which statisticians like to use, and I'll choose as well.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If you can, so I'm just curious, why is the non-homestead residential rate lower than the homestead?
So, Madam Chair and council members, so looking at that, the median valued property, when comparing the non-homestead residential to the homestead residential, because the non-homesteaded property is taxed at 100% of capacity, and homesteaded properties have that exclusion, they're paying less tax to begin with, and so that's why the change isn't quite as great.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. And if I may add on, if you look at the tax itself, the tax is higher for the non-homesteaded properties, and so those would be generally understood to be rental properties. So then, putting it all together, we have a slide that we like to share that shows the distribution of the impacts of the tax impacts. And so the way to read this graph is, so in that first bar on the left-hand side, 3% of residential parcels will see a decline or an increase of less than 0%. So a decline in their property taxes in 2020 as compared to 2019. 23% of parcels will see no change. And then it goes on from there. The red line that you see is the median increase. So half of residential properties will see a property tax increase of more than 6.7%. Half will see a property tax increase of less than 6.7%. And every time we talk about property taxes, we like to stress the property tax refund programs that are offered by the state. These are available both to homeowners and renters. There are income phase outs for the renter's tax credit and the homeowner's credit. There is a special homestead credit refund that is exclusive of an individual homeowner's income. If a property sees a tax increase of more than 12% that's also greater than $100, then they're eligible for this special credit. So looking back at this slide, when you see 13% or more, in almost all cases, those will be more than $100, and so those property owners are eligible for a credit through the state program. And so that's just something important for Minneapolis property owners to keep in mind, as it's state money that's available exactly for this purpose. So as Councilmember Palmisano mentioned, last year we did 2 presentations. I stopped at that last slide and did a separate presentation on the 5-year financial direction. This year I'm going to try to be very adventurous and do the 5-year financial direction in 2 slides. And unfortunately, that does count as adventurous for me. If you do happen to have your budget book, or are looking at it online, this is on page 95. So there are a few changes from the 5-year financial direction that was adopted in 2019. The first is what I had mentioned earlier about planning for lower permit revenues. And so as we're planning for lower permit revenues, property taxes replace the source of revenue to pay for that inspection activity. The second item is the item we discussed relating to reduced franchise fees. There is a policy choice there to make about the rate, the franchise fee rate. A few years ago, that was increased for gas and electric. There is the option to increase that again to offset the reduction in revenue because the utilities are seeing lower revenues. And then just also to highlight, we will continue to use available fund balances for one-time spending as needed. On the uses side, what's new this year is the addition of the affordable housing levy of $1.5 million, the addition of the neighborhoods and NCR levy starting at $2 million in 2021 and increasing to $7 million in 2024. The addition of planned spending on the regulatory services revolving fund that I'd mentioned earlier. So the mayor has included year 1 of 2 of a phased move away from that fund and has planned for, or at least recommending we program in room for completely solving, and I'll put solving in air quotes, that problem next year. The last 3 items are a continuation of sort of planned spending items that have existed in prior 5-year financial direction. So the first is additional staffing for public safety. There was a 6-year plan that Mayor Hodges had put in place to increase the number of sworn officers to 901. That has been included in the last few budgets, and this 5-year financial direction continues that for years 4, 5, and 6 of the plan. The second item is increase to the election base budget, there was a plan to, over 5 years, add $200,000 each year to increase the base funding for elections, just recognizing that it's a complex operation that has been underfunded in the past. And finally, the 5-year financial direction for 2021 includes year 3 of the, so the 3rd year of the pilot Stable Homes, Stable Schools program that started last year. In total, or in sum, what that means in terms of percentage change for the levy is 6.1% in 2021, which compares to 8.23% is what was adopted at the end of last year, dropping down to 4.2% in 2025. So a lot of change that we've just talked through, but this is, at the end of the day, given what we know today and based on those planned spending items that I had just mentioned, along with continuing to fund current service levels, this is what those future property tax levies would look like.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much. I just want to ask about the public safety projection there. That looks very different than the last budget, the 5-year projection, which I think had, if I'm recalling it correctly, about $700,000 under each year. So, and then my understanding of the last time that was 700 like in 2021 it was 700,000, and then we'd be adding another $700,000 after that. So when we look at the 750,000 in 2021, are you saying on top of that we're going to add another 1.5 million in 2022, and then another 2.3 million in 2023, and 2.8 million in 24, and then 2.4 million in 25? So we need to add all those figures together, and $2, 4, 6, 7, 8, $9 million total.
So, Madam Chair and Council Member, I appreciate the good memory. Last year, we had talked about this very issue, and you had pointed out that the presentation of that item was a little bit inconsistent with the rest of the presentation of the 5-year financial direction. I thought it was a good point, and so we changed the presentation this year, which I think has added confusion as opposed to solving for that problem. So last year, the presentation was additive. So as you were saying, it was 750 in the first year, 750 in the second year. So for the year 2 impact, you would have to add those 2 together, and it would be 1.5 million. This year, what we're showing is cumulative. And so we're showing 750 in the first year, 1.5 in the second year, and you can interpret those two numbers independent of each other. So 1.5 means 1.5. It doesn't mean 1.5 plus 750.
So let's look at the election-based budget then underneath that. Does that operate the same way?
Yeah.
So we would add 200,000 in 2021, then we'd add an additional 200,000 for 2022, and then we wouldn't be adding any more, but we just keep that amount.
Madam Chair and Council Member, that's correct. So that shows that the end of the 5-year plan to add $200,000 each year, the last year to add $200,000 would be 2022, and then we wouldn't be
Take any away.
Yep.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Adding to the public safety question, so Mayor Hodges had put the money in for increasing the amount of officers. So how is that reflected in this year's budget, as that was included in the projections? Like, is that included with the 14 new officers? How is that reflected?
So, Madam Chair and Council Member, yes, it is included in the 14. Once we move into a year and the planned spending is there, it's, this isn't prescribing that happen, it's just creating the room. So in a sense, as that room for 6 additional officers was created and the mayor is proposing adding 14, it's being used for, you can think of it as being used for, the plan is being executed as planned.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? I'm not seeing any.
So, Madam Chair and members, just talking through next steps briefly, the Board of Estimate and Taxation is responsible for setting the maximum property tax levy. There will be a public hearing on this Wednesday night, September 11th, starting at 5:05, and I'll be giving an overview about those individual levies that the mayor is proposing, and then there will be opportunity for public comment. That maximum levy will then be set 2 weeks later on September 25th. We've got the department budget hearings listed here. I won't go through each line, but just to say those take place through the end of October. We do have about a month gap in our budget hearing calendar, and that just has to do with how the calendar lined up this year. And in particular, the high holy days kind of monkey our schedule around a little bit. As with last year, the council will be holding I really like the term that was coined last year, a halftime check-in, to see what the public's reaction is to the mayor's recommendation. That'll happen on November 7th. And then the traditional truth and taxation hearing occurs Wednesday night, December 4th, followed by budget markup on Friday morning into the afternoon as needed, December 6th, with a final public hearing and budget adoption on December 11th, which constitutes the dessert as requested by Council Vice President earlier. If there are no other questions, I just, again, encourage you to send your constituents to our city's website, where we hold the budget book and some additional analysis. We also have a series of videos that we started building last year and have added to this year, sort of explainers on budget process, on property taxes, on many of the things that I've discussed today, that I encourage you to point your constituents to as well.
Thank you, Director Intramural, for your time. Thank you to my colleagues for joining us. And we have 2 items, one motion. I will make one motion on both of the items. The first is to now formally receive and file the Mayor's 2020 recommended budget. And item number 2 is to receive and file this 2020 budget overview from Director Intramural. I'll go ahead and make both of those motions. Any questions or comments? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries. We are done with our business today, and we'll reconvene on September 12th. Thank you for your time.